Hello again to another Agakala Reacts. And today we'll be watching Architects break down the design of 4 iconic New York City museums from Architectural Digest. And we'll be watching that because on the 20th February, and that's today, but on the 1872, New York's Metropolitan Museum of Arts opened. And I believe in that video he's gonna be talking about that museum as well. So let's just start and go and see what he can say about iconic New York City museums and which one he's going to include.
The museums that New York City has to offer are each designed very differently for very different purposes. Their unique designs relate specifically to their unique collections. From the height of abstract expressionism to one of the largest collections in the world. Hi, I'm Michael Weitzner, and I've been an architect in New York City for over 35 years. Today we're going to break down 4 of the most visited art museums in New York City and see how they're designed for crowds, light, and art. First up, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So the Metropolitan Museum of Art sits on Fifth Avenue. It's 5 blocks long. It goes from 80th to 85th Street, which is actually about a quarter of a mile.
Oh my God!
So this grand museum with one of the greatest collections in the world is
That's a whole day in the museum for me, I guess.
You're a New Yorker. And it actually sits inside Central Park. So the museum was founded in 1872. And its original building was built in 1880 by the same architect who designed all the buildings in Central Park, along with Frederick Law Olmsted. And that person is Calvert Vaux. So let's take a look at his original design. This building is very typical of 1870s architecture. And that's because it has this very Victorian sort of Gothic style. It's got this mansard roof.
It's the same
it's made
building?
out of red brick with these limestone sort of base, and it's got these granite sort of details and these little flourishes, and it all has this sort of fairy tale, precious feel to it. So over the decades, the museum would be expanded greatly, but they never demolished the existing building. They just kept growing around it.
Oh,
and what I love about this photo is these 2 facades particularly are still visible in the museum today. Along the south, there's a sculpture court, and along the west facade here, they actually added the Lehman wing. Okay, let's take a look at the first expansion by Richard Morris Hunt. So in the 1890s, the museum commissioned Richard Morris Hunt
so like,
to give
20 years
it a
later,
greater
is it?
presence along Fifth Avenue. Richard Morris Hunt is also known for doing the base of the Statue of Liberty, as well as the huge Biltmore estate for the Vanderbilt family in North Carolina. He created the fabulous Great Hall, which is what you first walk into with all those beautiful arches.
That looks impressive.
And he also created that grand staircase within that brings you up to the 2nd floor. And it opened in 1902. He didn't want to replicate what was already there. He wanted to create his own statement. So where Vaux and Mold used this sort of Gothic, Victorian style of architecture, Hunt uses a totally classical style, Greek and Roman, and makes the entire building out of limestone, so that they have a very separate feel. What's great about this shot is you can see that there's no context. They're building in the park, so they essentially just have nature surrounding them. There's no buildings on either side of it, so the architect didn't have to react to any of the existing architecture.
I want to know if those trees still exist.
What he wanted.
They're on the front.
Case, it was create this grand facade.
I don't recall from what they showed.
And if you look at this photo, you could see the original building is sitting back here in Central Park, and
probably
you can see that Richard Morris
Hunt
cut
them down to build more of the museum
to Fifth Avenue. And just 8 years later, they would almost double the size of the existing museum.
Yeah, you go. You see the trees already gone.
By McKim, Mead & White.
The new one, though.
So in 1910, the museum hired the great firm McKim, Mead & White to put on even longer wings on either side. And this is what makes the museum go from basically 80th Street to 85th Street along Fifth Avenue. And what McKim, Mead & White did by adding these huge wings is they basically kept the original building intact, like Hunt, and they also stayed with Hunt's style of architecture, this sort of Beaux-Arts classical style. And these wings are so huge now that they've essentially eliminated the park from the context, and they've created this 5-block long street wall. So they've, in a sense, built their own context. So in just 30 years, the museum has already become this sort of behemoth, and yet there were many, many more expansions to come.
It's just
so this
impressive.
is an overhead shot looking at what the museum looks like
Look how
today.
big it is.
You could see the Richard Morris Hunt addition right here in the center. You could see the McKim, Mead & White wings on either end.
Oh, there's still stuff on the back.
You could see the original Calvert Vaux and Jacob Ray Mold building here. And then you could see that they've totally infilled And what's amazing about this photograph is that this museum is almost the size of the Great Lawn, if not bigger, which contains 6 baseball fields. And this building, it's 2 million square feet. That's unbelievably large when you think the average two-bedroom apartment in New York City is actually 1,000 square feet. So that's basically 2,000 New York City two-bedroom apartments. So this is one of the most visited museums in the world, but because of its size and its massive scale, actually it's able to accommodate an enormous amount of people. This building is so big, it's like a city unto itself. And because of that, the crowds just sort of disperse within it, unlike other museums where people get really sort of congested. And it's got one of the great urban spaces in New York City with its huge entrance staircase. So paintings are sensitive to natural light. In fact, they should be protected from natural light typically because they will degrade over time. So architects typically want to limit the amount of natural light in galleries, but they want to maximize the amount of natural light in gathering places. And because it's such a wide and varied collection, there are some areas that have skylights, like in the sculpture court, where natural light is welcome. And there are other areas where the artwork is very protected. Vox and Mold's original building has these blind windows at the top. Hunt follows that same idea, except for in the Great Hall where the people are and you want the natural light. This building is so big that there's buildings on display within the building. There's an Egyptian temple, a Chinese garden, the nave of a medieval church, a Frank Lloyd Wright living room, the porch to a Louis Comfort Tiffany garden estate, the facade of an early American bank, a 2-storied courtyard of a Spanish villa. It's unbelievable how many different and varied spaces
2 days to see all that, at least. Not all of it, but just 2 days to just see the Metropolitan Museum.
After year, and there's still
because there's a Metropolitan Opera as well.
And this being one of the largest collections in the world, and this building being one of the biggest buildings in the world, they can't even fit it all here. They have to keep some of it at the cloisters all the way uptown. Next up, another great museum that created its own context, but in a different way. The Museum of Modern Art was founded in 1929, but they didn't build their first building until 1939 by Philip Goodwin and Edward Durrell Stone. And they built that building in Midtown Manhattan, of all places, on 53rd Street, between 5th and 6th Avenue. So the Museum of Modern Art was founded by these 3 very important women, Lily P. Bliss, Mary Quinn Sullivan, and Abby Aldrich Rockefeller. And at that time, West 53rd Street was sort of a fancy part of town where people of means lived in richly appointed brownstones and townhouses. You can see these 4- and 5-story, what are basically residential buildings flanking it. And then right in the center of that is this great modern Bauhaus-style building. So what gives it this sort of Bauhaus style is that it's this very stripped down form of modernism. And it's got these ribbon windows. It has this cantilevered roof at the top with these circular openings. And it's got this very large section of translucent
and this
glass.
Is how it
so
looked
they specifically built a modern style building to house their modern art. It's basically the same height as all the other buildings. But it's a
genius idea, in my opinion.
In character because of its modern styling. And it really stands out in its context, calling a lot of attention to itself. So in comparison to collections from previous eras, like at the Metropolitan, the galleries that display the modern art are these clean white boxes, as compared to these sort of ornate galleries that display older art.
I'm interested in seeing all of them anyway.
This was like the first of its kind in this country to show modern art, and they did it in a very modern way. So in this original context, the museum really stands out amongst these sort of older buildings. But as years went by and MoMA expanded, much like the Metropolitan expanded, they completely changed the context of 53rd Street. So let's take a look at what it looks like now. So here's 53rd Street in the year 2023. And you can see the original building is still there.
Yeah.
But just to the right of it, you can see
there's a lot
that Philip
changed,
Johnson did in the 1950s. And just past it to the west, you could see an addition that was by Cesar Pelli, who did this big tower that the museum expanded into. And then in 2004 by Yoshio Taniguchi, which added that blade sign and all this glass. And then as recently as 2019, there was an addition into the Jean Nouvel Tower that stands all the way to the west. So basically, MoMA now takes up the entire block, except for the 2 ends. Unlike the Met, who made a point of sort of unifying their facade along 5th Avenue. Here on 53rd Street, MoMA doesn't do that. It's a series of very different buildings. So really, you have no idea that it's all the same institution. So it's really interesting about these extensions is though most of them are made of glass. From the interior, you'd never know that because the art doesn't want all that glass. And in fact, they built solid walls in front of most of that glass. And only occasionally do you get a glimpse, do they have a little break in those solid walls, and you can see the street beyond. So now, you no longer enter through what was the original entrance. Now you enter much further west down the street and you enter into this huge atrium. And when you're within the museum, you don't really comprehend that you're walking through these different buildings. It has grown so large to 708,000 square feet that it's now an endless maze of these white box rooms. But within that endless maze, there's some amazing art. There's Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night. There's Henri Rousseau's Sleeping Gypsy. There's some of the greatest Picassos and Matisses in the world. There's Jasper Johns and Rauschenberg and Warhol. And the hits just keep on coming. And for all the fatigue that this museum engenders, because there's so much and it's so big, it's only 1/3 the size of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Next up, the Guggenheim. This is Frank Lloyd Wright's take on a modern museum. It's just a few blocks up from the Metropolitan, also on Fifth Avenue. Like MoMA, it was built in a residential neighborhood, but this neighborhood has remained residential. And it's completely different than any of the buildings surrounding it. So all these apartment houses, what they do is they form this very solid street wall along Fifth Avenue. And the Guggenheim completely breaks that. It's actually sort of this object building that is devoid of relationship to its context. So Frank Lloyd Wright had very definite ideas of what he thought a museum should be. And that idea was a continuous loop. So instead of a museum where you wandered into one gallery, wandered out, and wandered into another gallery and wandered out, he thought it should be one linear experience from start to finish. So this main form here is actually the galleries wrapping around a central atrium with a skylight. So Frank Lloyd Wright's conception was you actually take the elevator up and you descend down the entire ramp and see the display. And he's dictating the experience of the way you see the art. So you either see it going up or you see it coming down, but you see it in one sort of linear sequence.
That's a bad
so this
idea
coiled
to
spring
see it
idea
too,
was
I
actually
guess.
based on an idea by Le Corbusier of a sketch he did in 1929 called The Infinite Museum. So Corbusier's idea was that you would start with a museum, a space in the center, and that you would just keep spiraling out. So the idea is that you could add on to it infinitely as the collection grows, which would have been a great idea for the Metropolitan. The museum spirals out, very much the way that a Nautilus shell spirals out as it grows. And that's based on the golden section. And the golden section is basically a square with a ratio added onto it. So if you take this rectangle, which is 1 by 1.61, what you basically get is a square here, and then you just keep progressing in with the squares, and they get smaller and smaller as you progress in. And when you connect the center points of those squares, it actually forms the spiral that keeps going in. This is an ancient ratio discovered by like the Greeks, and a lot of proportions of parts of architecture are based on it, as well as many paintings. So let's go inside and take a look at Frank Lloyd Wright's application of this idea. Wherever you are along this spiral, that atrium is always part of the experience with this beautiful skylight above. So it's this grand, beautifully lit, really impactful space. And it's unlike any other in New York City. But it does lead to some drawbacks. So Frank Lloyd Wright had very definitive views of what art was. And it's almost like he couldn't or wouldn't see beyond that. And at the time this gallery, when this museum was built, it was the 1950s, the height of abstract expressionism, with these huge wall-sized canvases. And this museum doesn't really lend itself to that kind of display. So what he did was, he tilted the walls just a bit. He tilted them out like a painter would when they're painting on their easel. This shot clearly illustrates what it's like on the ramp when you're looking at the art. So you can see these strong structural piers limit the width horizontally, and the height between the ramps limits the space vertically. And because of that, the pieces of art that you could show were limited in size. And then the wall you could see is slightly canted as you can see there. And the other, and what I think is even more significant drawback to seeing art on this spiral, is that you can't stand back from the painting. You could only go as far as this rail to get back. Otherwise, you have to look all the way across the atrium, as you can see here, and obviously that's way too far back. And the other thing that this does is there's only so much space for people to congregate. And at a very popular show, it can get very crowded. So if there's a lot of people standing and looking at one piece of art, the circulation path shrinks and shrinks as the crowd increases. So when Frank Lloyd Wright got the commission, he was directed to create a monument for art. And instead, a lot of people think what he did was create a monument to himself. But it's one hell of a monument. Next up, the original building for the Whitney Museum of American Art, which later became the Met Breuer, which now has become the Frick. Who knows what will become next? Another museum built in a residential neighborhood, but this one's a little further east on Madison Avenue in the mid-70s. And another building that sort of cuts itself off from the context, but in a different way. So this is a shot looking southeast, and you could see Madison Avenue runs in front, and this building is sort of like an inverted ziggurat in that it steps out as it goes up. So this building was designed by Marcel Breuer, who was a Bauhaus-trained architect who sort of made his name originally with furniture. And what he did here with this museum is he actually slices off with these vertical walls of concrete the beautiful brownstones to the south and the brownstones over here to the east. And it has very few windows, and they're this odd shape. They're this sort of trapezoid shape that when you view from head on, almost look like you're looking at them in perspective. The other significant thing about this museum that sort of cuts it off from the sidewalk and from its context is it actually springs out of a moat. There's actually a recessed sculpture garden below, and there's this bridge that goes across, like a bridge across a moat, into the main entrance of the museum. So the Bauhaus was this school in Germany that took a modern view of all the arts, not just architecture, but it involved product design, and it involved furniture, it involved textile design and painting, and it created this holistic view of the arts in a very, very modern way. So the other thing about the Bauhaus was that it was about simplification, and that an object is defined by its nature.
Those are interesting designs.
To this building is that this building is extremely simple. It's really about materials and functionality. So many people think of this building as a brutalist building, but that really wasn't the intention. And in fact, there's really these very beautiful and sumptuous materials. So this building's built entirely out of jet mist granite, which is this kind of grayish, blackish granite with these sort of mists of white that run through it. And it creates this very solid piece. And it has very few windows, as you could see. Just 7 within the galleries. So as opposed to a whole wall of glass that gives you a whole expansive view, the windows that are on the facade are all there, almost like another painting on the wall to give you the frame of a very particular view. And in fact, the circulating stair is meant to be part of the experience with its beautiful and lush materials of wood, slate, terrazzo, and concrete. So this is the smallest museum that we've looked at, and it actually caused quite a bit of complications for the Whitney because they outgrew it pretty soon, and they tried to add on to it. Once in the late 70s with designs by Michael Graves, later in the early 2000s with designs by Rem Koolhaas, and even a few years later with designs by Renzo Piano. But they eventually abandoned all of those ideas and moved south to a new building by Piano in the meatpacking district. The other thing that distinguishes this museum from a lot of the others we looked at is that these interior galleries were made to display big, modern pieces, and they've got very open, loft-like spaces with concrete gridded ceilings that maximize flexibility. So these are some of the great and unique museums that New York City has to offer. Tell me what other great museums you'd like to see us break down in the comments below.
Well, I don't know. What kind of other museums are there? Obviously there's loads, especially in New York, isn't there? But no, that the Metropolitan Museum definitely is something I want to see. We've been in New York for like literally 12 hours in between our flights from Vegas to Ireland about 4 years ago, and we just did the hop on hop off bus tour. And we probably drove past it. It's massive, sprawling, like massive city. It's very busy as well. So I would love to go there, maybe in summertime instead of winter. and it's just kind of like spend some time there and in the museums and see all the art and things like that. But we'll see how it goes. We'll see. Anyway, that was very good. That, especially about the Metropolitan Museum, that they decided, instead of just destroying what was already there, that they just decided to add it on. So you can still see the original building from 1800s, and it's just, and then another one, and then another, and it's just added on without actually destroying what was already there. That was very thoughtful, and I think kind of genius as well. The other ones were very interesting too. So, have you been in any of those museums? Would you recommend going there? And in case of Metropolitan Museum, what is a must go see of what do you have to see? If you have not much time, what is it that you should go and see at the Metropolitan Museum? If you want to go there and see something, what is it that you have to see? Like what you recommend. So, thank you very much for watching, and I see you tomorrow. Bye!